Let's talk about bees. You may think you already know an awful lot about bees. They live in hives with thousands of individuals. They make sweet honey, and their honeycombs are nice, neat structures full of little hexagons. They also swarm. If you thought all those things, you are thinking about honeybees. Did you know that honeybees aren't native anywhere in North America? I want to talk about native bees instead. Texas alone has 1,500 species of native bees. It's estimated that 10% of our native bees haven't even been named and described yet. Our native bees are amazing. They come in a huge variety of sizes, shapes, colors, and habits. Their life histories are intricate and interesting too. Though most of our native bees also collect nectar and pollen like honeybees do, some collect wax, oils, or resins to feed their larvae or construct their homes. Our native bumblebees come closest to being like honeybees. They do live in large groups, but only about 400 individuals for each community, not thousands and thousands like honeybees. They do make honey and they do make wax, but their structures for holding honey are nowhere near as neat and organized as the honeybees are. Bumblebees also have queens and workers with different jobs, but their queens are the only members of their community to live through the winter. The rest of the workers and the males will die off at the end of the fall season. Scientists have recently discovered that bumblebees can solve complex puzzles, and here in Texas, we're still learning where each of our species lives. Aside from our bumblebee species, the vast majority of our Texas native bee species don't live in social groups at all. They're what's known as solitary bees. Each female will construct her own nest site. She'll provision that nest site with food for her developing larvae that's just right for her species. Unlike honeybees, who are generalists, many of our native bees, up to 20 to 30%, are specialists or super specialists. That means they can only use the pollen or nectar from a limited number of plants, in some cases, just one species. Some of our specialist bees are only active as adults for a couple of weeks out of the entire year when the plants they specialize on are blooming. Specialist bees have ways to sense heat and moisture and can skip emerging in a year when their plants won't be doing well. About 70% of our solitary native bees are going to dig their nest site into the ground. They're looking for an open patch of soil and may dig down as deep as 18 inches before constructing side galleries. They're expert architects and have ways to waterproof their burrows with a variety of secretions. They also supply an antibacterial and antifungal lining to keep their larvae safe. This bee species, one of the polyester or cellophane bees, literally secretes a plastic polymer lining for its burrow. Sometimes ground nesting bees will nest very close to others of their species in large groupings. This can look like a coordinated effort, but it's not. It's simply an aggregation of bees that are there because the nesting materials are just right in that location. The remaining 30% of our solitary native bees are not ground nesters at all. They're tube or tunnel nesters, and they're looking for a small, narrow space that's kind of deep in which to put their eggs. I've seen them nesting in hollow bones, seashells, faucet handles, yard tools, almost any place that has a narrow opening and a space inside in which they can build. Tube and tunnel nesters are also looking for hollow stems in which to lay their eggs. They can simply find or chew a small hole in the stem and make their nest site inside. If the stem has a pithy center, they're happy to excavate that until there's a gallery in which to lay their eggs. Each egg the female lays gets its own little ball of provisions, usually a mixture of pollen and nectar, but sometimes this can be oils, waxes, or other substances collected from plants. The female solitary bee works by herself to collect enough nectar and pollen or other food stores for her larva. When she gets enough for one, she'll have that installed in the nest site, leave one egg, and then create some kind of partition between that and the next nest cell over. That partition can be made of chewed flowers or leaves or wood, or it might even be made of masonry or other materials. Each female solitary bee averages fewer than 2 dozen eggs in her lifetime, very unlike the honeybee queen or the bumblebee queen. For each egg she lays, it can take up to 200 foraging trips out to nearby flowers to gather the necessary provisions. Some species, particularly those that are hyper specialized, will have only one generation per year, while others continue to forage as long as food sources are abundant. They may produce several generations in one growing season. Because male solitary bees don't really help create the nest site, they don't really have a place to be once they emerge as adults. So you'll frequently find them sleeping, sometimes in groups, like this adorable two-spotted longhorn bee. They'll simply choose a vertical stalk or piece of plant material in the garden, clamp on with their jaws, and stay there for the night. It's not unusual to find them still sleeping there on a cold, dewy morning. They don't really have much of a job to get up for, and as long as there is nectar for them to drink and females to breed with, that's all they're concerned with. Some male bees will stake out a likely patch of flowers in a landscape and wait there for receptive females to come along. They can defend that space against other male bees, but it's not as serious as it looks because no male bees have stingers and they won't really hurt each other. It's simply an aerial battle of intimidation and bumping until one bee backs down and leaves to find another patch of flowers. One really important thing to note about our solitary native bees is that they aren't aggressive. Because the female works by herself to provision her nest site, it's not worth her while to defend it. She could lose all her eggs and all her offspring and her own life if she tries that. So she may try to intimidate you a little bit, but it's very, very unlikely that she'll sting you. No male bees have stingers. Many of our native solitary bee females don't have stingers, and if they do, they're usually weak and ineffective. Their venom is not optimized for mammals since they don't create honey that's likely to be raided by something like a raccoon or a skunk. To get stung by one of our solitary native female bees, you almost have to press the bee between a sleeve and your tender skin of your wrist or something like that. If you do get stung, expect it to be less painful and less irritating than a mosquito bite. Apart from people who breed bumblebees professionally and have been stung multiple times, there are no known allergies to native bee stings. Now that you know they're safe to live with and work around, maybe you want some bees in your yard. All you need to do is provide the right nesting materials, freedom from pesticides, and freedom from mechanical disturbance, and they'll show up. Of course, they're going to need plenty of high quality flowers for nectar, pollen, and other essential elements of their diet. For ground nesting bees, they need a piece of open soil. Sandy is usually best. For tunnel and tube nesting bees, a collection of old stems from the garden placed in an out-of-the-way corner of the yard, or some reeds or bamboo or purchased tubes collected in a box someplace will be what they're looking for. Even a rotting wood pile with old holes from wood-boring insects and beetles can make a great place for native bees to nest. In the bee world, the males are often more highly colored than the females, like this male southern carpenter bee, compared to the female southern carpenter bee. Sometimes males will have a yellow face patch that the females will not. Let's explore some of the amazing bees you'll find in Texas. The largest and most distinguishable bees in our landscape are our bumblebees. They're large, they're black and yellow and fuzzy all over. American bumblebee females are the easiest to tell apart. They have a thorax that's half yellow and half black. That's the marble-shaped body section where all the legs attach. None of our other bumblebees or carpenter bees have that half yellow, half black thorax, and you'll be able to see that even while they're flying. The male American bumblebee has more color in other sections. The ways different bees collect pollen can help you tell which bees they are. Bumblebees collect wet pollen packed into a little scoop on the female's hind leg. There are some bees even tinier than this one, but this little lasioglossum, hardly bigger than a gnat, is one of our local bees. Here it is posing in front of the edge of a U.S. dime. Bees are really hard to identify down to the species level. It usually takes a dead specimen, but one whole group of bees can be called the metallic sweat bees. They come in green, gold, silver, and bronze, and gunmetal blue. Our early spring bees include the blue orchard bees, Osmia ribiflorus. The females are deep blue and shiny and sort of chunky. The males are smaller and slimmer and more of a green blue with longer antennae. Some male bees take the long antennae to extremes. There's a whole group of bees called longhorn bees where the males have antennae so long that if you folded them back, they would come past the thorax and onto the abdomen section of the bee. One of the most frequent visitors to homemade or store-purchased nest boxes is the leafcutter bee. They'll cut neat round circles out of leaves or flowers with their massive jaws, and then take those and roll them all up to create their own tube for laying their eggs in. Those tubes will be tucked into little pockets, even under the nest inside a birdhouse sometimes. Leafcutter bees and their relatives carry their pollen under their abdomen. Look at this female loaded down. She's going to boost her abdomen high up in the air to keep that pollen from rubbing off. Sunflower bees carry their pollen in really large, poofy hairs on their legs. Their larvae can only digest the pollen of sunflowers and things in the sunflower family. Some bees are actually nest parasites of other bees. Usually they look something like the bees whose nest they'll raid, and usually they wait for that nest to be under construction and fully provisioned before laying their eggs in the host nest. Their larvae will hatch and kill the larvae or the egg of the host and proceed to eat all the food for themselves. This odd bee is Erychrosis lata, one of our parasitic bees. Triepiolus is another genus of parasitic bees. They carry a smiley face around on their backs, but they are nest parasites or kleptoparasites, just like the Erychrosis lata. Coleoxys is another one of our native bees. Here it is pictured on the same flower with a species it's probably stalking. This female kleptoparasite is going to follow the other female back to her nest under construction and sling her own eggs in there. You might think parasites are all bad, but like having lions in a landscape with wildebeest, it means you have enough wildebeest to support the lions. So having enough native bees to support parasitic bees on native bees means you're probably doing something right. All of them are going to need nectar and pollen to grow. Resin bees actually construct their nest sites out of tiny pebbles glued together with the resin scraped from plants. They may look more like wasps than bees, but they're really some of our solitary nesting bees. We're out of time now, but there's so much more to explore in the world of native bees. I hope you will.